Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprints. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, with new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this program on YouTube. Hit the bell, be notified when new content is made available. On today's show, we're going to be talking about Indigenous procurement, the problems with it, and a bunch of non-Indigenous companies getting billions in government contracts. So to talk about this and much, much more, we bring on the person leading the charge, Garnett Genuis, the Member of Parliament for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back on the Blueprint. And Jamie, you've been leading our team on Indigenous issues for such a long time, and you've done incredible work there. So it's great to be able to have this conversation with someone who obviously knows a lot about the topic.
Well, I do appreciate the work you're doing as well, bringing to light the fact that there are shell companies set up that are bidding on government contracts worth millions, tens of millions, and the list goes on, but not actually Indigenous owned, which the program was set up to do, so you could at least get some Indigenous companies getting some of the government contracts. Because in some cases, a lot of them, especially if they're small, don't have the capacity to go through that application process, which can be quite onerous, even for the biggest of companies.
Yeah, so let me say just a few things about kind of how I got to learning about this and then kind of what we're doing, drilling into it. Most people will be by now familiar with the big ArriveCan scandal. And tens of millions spent on a glitchy app that didn't work, sent lots of people into quarantine, even though they filled out all the rules that they were supposed to fill out because of error in a version. And you had... This kind of opened my eyes to the fact that you've got a bunch of these very small companies. They're not actually doing the work. They're kind of specialized in getting government contracts and then subcontracting them, and then they get a massive benefit in the process. Well-connected insiders close to the NDP Liberal government. Their business is getting contracts and subcontracting, right? I've used this analogy before. You're hiring someone to paint your fence. You hire me for $100. I hire someone else for $50, and I don't do any of the work, and I just pass along the contract. And if that happens to you once or twice, you're going to want to go direct at some point. But the government of Canada has this privileged special relationship with a few of these insider companies, and that's costing taxpayers a lot. So this was the ArriveCan scandal, but in the context of that, we saw that there's this company called Dalian that got part of this contract, and that company was identified as an Indigenous company, which helped them access a set-aside. The government's got to set aside 5% of contracts are supposed to go to Indigenous companies. But they're a very tiny company, 2 people. They're in joint venture with someone else, and that joint venture allows them to get the contract. So we started digging into kind of, okay, who's actually getting these Indigenous set-asides. And there's a few different instances of possible abuse, right? One is a company pretending to be Indigenous that's not, somebody who's just lying, just outright faking it. Another possibility is you have a tiny company that's qualified as Indigenous, but they're subcontracting all the work to non-Indigenous companies. So it's that flow-through that I described. The Indigenous company is part of that flow-through, but it's 1 or 2 people that are getting the benefit, and they're subcontracting all of the work to non-Indigenous firms. And then another possibility is an abuse of a joint venture. Joint ventures are a legitimate business tool, but if an Indigenous partner is helping get that contract, that Indigenous partner should be benefiting from the contract. They shouldn't just be paid a fee to help check a box. They should actually be part of the process. So these are various kinds of views. And so the first step we took at committee was to request information on this. We did a detailed document production order. And in particular, we said we want to see the subcontract. So in the case of Indigenous companies that get contracts, we want to see who they're subcontracting to. And actually found that there was a complete lack of information being collected in terms of the subcontracts. We don't know if or who is enforcing the subcontracting rules. There's a rule that it's supposed to be that if it's happening under the Indigenous set-aside, that 1/3 of the subcontracts have to be Indigenous, but there's no indication of if that's being tracked or enforced. So that's the story that kind of brings us to this point. The Government Operations Committee started studying this issue, and we heard testimony directly from the AFN saying that, in their view, most of the companies getting these contracts are shell companies. So there's some instance of workarounds being used, and the government's very set on trying to say they've checked a box. But the purpose of this program is supposed to be dispersed benefit within Indigenous communities, economic development happening within, exactly, reconciliation via the increase in economic opportunity. And yet it's pretty clear from the testimony of the AFN and other witnesses we've heard, as well as the lack of tracking, that there are big gaps in terms of what's actually happening. And I think it's pretty performative of the government. They're trying to look like they care, but they're not taking the time to measure the results.
Well, let's cue up cut one. We have a clip from committee talking about what you had just mentioned, but going into a little bit more specifics, because this is an issue I think is just the tip of the iceberg, which you're able to, what you have already exposed. So let's play cut one.
The acronym CPAIN, which stands for Corporations Posing as Indigenous Nations. The people that we expose as fraudulent in taking up space to which they are not entitled move freely across this continent. We have discovered that there are billions of dollars in resources that are pilfered by corporations, entities, and individuals who are pretending to be Indigenous when they are not, hence the term pretendians and pretendianism. This is a very serious issue. We do not wish to suggest otherwise by using the word pretend. We use it for ease of conversation in those who must speak about this issue.
Yeah, so when you look at it in that context, that all this money was kind of set aside for Indigenous-owned companies, but the government isn't really doing their due diligence to ensure that their own targets are being met. But we see this across the board on so many things. Just the respect for taxpayer dollars to actually achieve the outcomes they're supposed to achieve are just falling through the cracks everywhere.
Yeah, I totally agree. The approach of this government is to try to look like they care. It's virtue signaling, performative allyship, whatever the term is that we're using, and there isn't an interest in actually measuring and assessing the results. I think it's a particular conservative trait to say we care about outcomes. What's the purpose of this policy supposed to be? And supporting economic development in Indigenous communities, obviously something that you've been championing for years. So important to us. Looking at the suite of policies that support empowerment and control through economic development. It's so important. And here we see how a policy that should be aiming at that is opening itself up to so many workarounds. And I questioned Patty Haidu about this a few months back at committee. She's the Liberal minister for this, and she shrugged off the criticisms. She said, "Well, the purpose of the policy is just to measure indigeneity, and then you get on the list, and then you're good to go." But the program is not effectively measuring indigeneity, and it's not. These concerns about abuse, they're coming from Indigenous leaders themselves, right? So we're magnifying their concerns. Various Indigenous organizations have asked the Auditor General to look into this. We've passed a motion asking the Procurement Ombudsman to look into this as well. And I think we'll continue to see things revealed about how the Liberals, they wanted to look like they were checking a box, but they have not been paying attention to the results. And in fact, it seems like they've been presiding over a system that allows these well-connected insiders, these small insider companies that specialize in getting in contracts, to take advantage of the system, but then subcontracting it in ways that don't provide actual benefit to Indigenous communities.
If you look at the number of employees hired during the Liberals' time in office, when they created the Indigenous Services Department, the number of bureaucrats has jumped substantially, but we've had a parliamentary budget report saying that extra money to that department and what they're spending on isn't exactly getting the results that it's intended, to your point of outcomes, right? We've had Auditor General's report on housing, on clean water, on policing, and all the text is basically the same, that the government is failing on each and every one of them because, to your comments exactly, the outcomes are not the main issue. The badge of honor for the government seems to be the amount spent, not actually helping people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's based not on the result achieved, but on the amount spent. And in this case, we're talking about instances where according to Indigenous leaders, most of the money spent is going to the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to shell companies. I just finished traveling across the country and met with Indigenous leaders in a number of stops at Thunder Bay, in Winnipeg, in Regina, and one of the points that was raised was ensuring that these companies are able to build up infrastructure in the communities and are there for the long term, right? So you don't have a couple Ottawa insiders showing up saying, "Hey, we can check this box. We can help you satisfy your requirement." We need to be thinking about policies that contribute to long-term sustainable business development and prosperity. And so I came into this issue through that kind of procurement lens. Being on the Government Operations Committee, we do a ton of work on government scandals. And since then, I've done a ton of engagement with Indigenous leaders. And this issue is a major concern for them. And the issue around people pretending or trying to take advantage of benefits that are there for Indigenous people when they're not Indigenous, it's a big issue and a broader issue. So I think it's something that reminds us of the importance of looking at the results, measuring the outcomes, and not accepting an NDP Liberal government that is really much more about box checking instead of results. By the way, Jamie, I just wanted to say on that clip you showed, notably, partway through that meeting, the Liberals interrupted witness testimony by moving a procedural motion that could have been dealt with at another time. And we repeatedly tried to get the committee to go back to hearing from the witnesses who were there. In one case, a witness who had driven a very long distance in order to be at the committee. So Liberals and the NDP have shown really profound disrespect in trying to shut down witnesses who have made a significant effort to tell their stories about how their communities have been taken advantage of in this process. But
the Liberals and NDP are the two sides of the same coin, basically, right? They're all about money spent.
Totally,
right?
Totally. No, the Liberals and the NDP had to have a majority on that committee. So they were the ones that were working together to force us to be on this procedural issue instead of attending to the important opportunity to hear from the witnesses who were in front of us. The next day when we had government officials, they let the government officials testify. We had questions for them, of course, but they let the government officials testify. But they disrupted testimony from Indigenous leaders partway through. So that was really important, really disappointing. And it underlines that, Liberals are, they're always stretching their elbows, patting themselves on the back on these issues. But we need to actually listen to Indigenous leaders themselves who are saying the results are not lining up with the government's self-congratulatory messages.
So where do we go from here? I know you're on this, the committee's on this, you're fighting for answers. What's next?
Yeah, I mean, the investigations of the Government Operations Committee are continuing. There are so many scandals right now that there's different things happening at different committees where and we're looking at multiple different scandal issues of the Government Operations Committee. So it's sort of something that it's not kind of every meeting. We're kind of coming back to it. But there's a lot of interest in this study. There's been a lot of interest from the public, in particular from Indigenous leaders. We've heard from a lot of Indigenous businesses that are doing great work, building their businesses, investing back in their communities, who have come to us to share their concerns. One thing I'll say just as well, and some of the feedback we're getting from these great positive examples of Indigenous businesses, is that a lot of government procurement is very opaque and inaccessible. So if you started a business and you're offering exactly the product the government wants, but you haven't dealt with government before, it can be very, very difficult. In some cases, there are requirements like you had to have had a certain number of references within the federal government itself. So you could be a successful company that's actually done business with other provincial governments and other governments around the world, and then you come to the Canadian government, and basically the answer is, well, you haven't done business with us before, so you're at a major disadvantage. If we want to give opportunity to people that haven't had opportunity before, Indigenous-owned businesses, other minority-owned businesses that may have historically been at a disadvantage. The best way to give them opportunity is to open up and democratize the procurement process in general, to make it easier for anyone who has the right product to be able to put their bid forward. But various analyses of this, including from the Procurement Ombud, have shown how a protection for insiders makes it very hard for those who are kind of
the barriers to competition, right?
Exactly.
But big government loves this, right?
Yeah.
Big government loves big business.
Yeah.
It's easier to deal with, right? You don't have all these little companies kind of doing their own thing, right? You have a few big ones that have the capacity to apply through these complex application process that Ottawa has come up with, where the little companies, the startups or the medium size, they have a bit harder time to do it.
Yeah.
And you're right. We have to make it easier, not harder.
Yeah.
So
100%. We're
pretty much out of time. Question period's coming up, but the guests always get the last word. So the floor is yours.
Well, as we've kind of gone into this issue, there's two things that really stick out to me. One is just the building record of scandal with this NDP Liberal government, and like there's so many different things. We've got the Green Slush Fund issue in the House of them not handing over the documents. At the Government Operations Committee, it's the condo issue, that overpriced condo they bought in New York, and it's the Indigenous procurement issues. It's ArriveCan and other procurement issues. So there's so many different scandals we're dealing with. It underlines just how much good we can do with a Conservative government that is going to be disciplined about connecting money spent with results. And then the other thing that I'm learning through this process and really excited about is just the appetite, the desire, the opportunity for economic development in a partnership with Indigenous leaders. And a lot of that's in the resource sector, and coming from a Conservative background where we're excited about the resource sector, that's good news. I mean, partnering with Indigenous leaders on that is going to be very exciting. But it's across the spectrum in terms of different kinds of businesses and opportunities. So it shouldn't be a government knows best approach. It should be a genuinely partnering and pro-resource approach as we as the Canadian government under Conservative leadership works constructively with Indigenous communities to unlock those economic opportunities. So hopefully very soon we'll be able to do away with this liberal scandal mire and unleash the economic potential of our country.
I couldn't agree with you more. Garnett Genuis, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having
Member
me.
of Parliament for Sherwood Park, so Fort Saskatchewan. Thank you for your time, Garnett. Thank you for yours. This is probably a message you're not hearing in the mainstream media, so let's get it out. Like, comment, subscribe, and share this program. Tell your friends. They can also download it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. You name it, it is out there. Hit the bell on YouTube for new content. Be notified. Until next week, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.